Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining and welcome to the New Hampshire Network event, What Climate Solutions Work for You, Your Community, and the World, where you'll get to test your favorite climate solutions and see how they compare with what we need to do globally to preserve a livable world. This event is brought to you by the New Hampshire Network for Environment, Energy, and Climate. The New Hampshire Network was created 2 years ago to connect groups across the state that share common goals and are working locally in our towns, at the state level and beyond, to promote action and get results. Before we get started, let's take a moment to acknowledge that this event takes place in Ndakina, the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude this land, the waterways, and the people who have stewarded Ndakina through many generations. By participating here tonight or watching the recording, you're part of our generation's effort to resume responsible stewardship of this region and beyond. The recently released sixth assessment report has been called the IPCC's final warning, since there's unlikely to be another IPCC assessment report before 2030, by which time the world will have exceeded the carbon budget to keep temperature rise within the 1.5 degrees agreed upon by governments in the 2015 Paris Accord. The science has been done. Individual efforts to reduce climate pollution are insufficient to maintain a relatively safe climate. Our only chance to hold warming below 1.5 degrees, or even 2, is to make significant changes in policies around the world. The goal of our event tonight is to give you a perspective on the power of different policy options at the global level that can be used to stabilize our Earth's climate system by modifying human activities that have pushed it out of balance on our watch. We hope the insights provided will help citizens focus their climate and energy advocacy effectively and give policymakers a deeper understanding of the relative power, costs, and interplay between different energy and climate policies. We also hope this helps policymakers anticipate future international and national policy changes and decisions they're making for us today. We'll spend the next hour being led through an En-ROADS workshop by Peter Dugas, followed by I will discuss some of the major policies and how our state can help and citizens can help accelerate adoption of those policies and prepare for them. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. Peter, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate it. I'm so happy to be here, and thanks everybody for taking time out of your Monday evening to learn about this stuff. John and I are colleagues on separate states. John is the main New Hampshire state coordinator for Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm the main state coordinator of Citizens Climate Lobby. We've got a lot that we can collaborate on. We're very similar in states and demographics and everything. So I hope that this will be I'm kind of wearing two different hats here, both as the volunteer coordinator for Maine volunteers at Citizens Climate Lobby. We have about 2,000 volunteers, at least in theory, of varying activities, some of whom we see only once a year, who can send like a 30-second message to their congresspeople, and we're thankful for that. And others on the other extreme come with us to every lobby meeting and go to Washington, D.C. in June, which are coming up, where we know we'll have a lot of really important conversations, not just with our own state folks that represent or the senators from this state, but also other states as well, as we kind of collaborate. But I'm also wearing the other hat as what's called an En-ROADS Climate Ambassador. En-ROADS is this model that we're going to spend most of our time digging into, and I want this to be a give and take where we can actually unmute ourselves and talk about policies and take a look at what we're looking at together and explore that model together. The En-ROADS model, when we get to it, I'll use some more explanation then, but it's put together by the nonprofit arm of MIT's Sloan School of Management based on climate education and climate research, called Climate Interactive. If you're really excited about it, you can take the 8-week training. They're always looking for new climate ambassadors, they're called. Which could spread that information, and they're just procuring and making it possible to really explore the latest information from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and their latest research on climate. We're bound to go through some tough stuff tonight. Anybody who has done enough research about climate in order to want to join a call like this understands that it's not for the faint of heart, this news, but I do promise that there's a lot of optimism. And if I forget the optimism, please put in the chat or unmute yourself and tell me to be optimistic, because I want that to be the case. The big thing to take away from this, if you forget anything else, is we don't know, we have more than just urgency, we have agency. We can do a lot more. We happen to live in perhaps the most influential corner of the most influential country on this global existential problem. So more on that in a second, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share a few slides with you. So if it gives a thumbs up for me, John, just to make sure that everyone's seeing this. Thank you. Okay, great. So there we are. Okay. So I'm going to go very quickly through the climate research on this, because this is for the folks, I really want to explore solutions and not so much the climate, but there's an incredibly robust line of evidence showing that climate change is not only happening, but it's anthropogenic. It's caused by us. We can look at the past 800,000 years of research, and we know where CO2 levels have been over those 800,000 years. And you can see where the 1950 level kind of hugs around here and where we are now. Not only is that true, but if you can squint and see that this is now just 400,000 years where we've been, you can see, yes, it's true, carbon dioxide levels have gone up and down over the years, over the millennia. And we know this from research where we're drilling ice bores and seeing where carbon content was from centuries ago. But we can compare that as it goes up and down. It's not a true one-to-one analog, but you can see that that has an obvious up and down mirrors more or less where global temperatures are, and of course where sea level is. And you can see this is actually old news. We're now at pushing beyond 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is well beyond where everything we had been before, as I said before. But there's some good news on this. Well, let me start off with a story before I get into everything. But oftentimes they say that it's always good to have a personal story about climate. One of the ones, my favorite ones, is I've been married for 16, 17 years now. And my wife's mother, her birthday is January 1st, which gives us a good excuse for knowing what to do on that holiday that few people know what to do with except sleep in. So every year when we were dating and then married on January 1st, we would pick up Maine shrimp, seen here on the left. You probably remember it. And you'd buy it wholesale, which means still in the shells, and you shell it. Wholesale is half as expensive in shrimp season, the cold months. Shell it yourself, put it in little baggies, put it in the freezer, and it was your protein source for the winter. And you can just imagine how many generations, in fact, how many millennia we had shrimp in the Gulf of Maine or in New England. New England shrimp is much smaller than the big Cajun-style southern shrimp. And when my daughter was born, that became a three generations of kind of New England women doing that chore. By the way, this is not a picture of my mother-in-law on the right. This is just something I grabbed from the internet to kind of show how long we've been doing this. But when my daughter came along, it was like three generations. It was like a Norman Rockwell painting, and that lasted until she was 5 years old when we knew that Maine shrimp were threatened, and they've since closed the Gulf of Maine to farming shrimp, and that is now a climate casualty. Our waters off the coasts of Maine and New Hampshire and Massachusetts, from Cape Cod basically to Newfoundland, that Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. So you don't have to use too much imagination of what's next if we don't take some serious action, which we're at the beginnings of doing, but we need more action and we need it fast. My joke is, the good news is you can still get Maine shrimp. The bad news is you have to go to Newfoundland, Canada to get it. And you don't have to imagine much beyond just too much imagination to realize what else is at risk. Winter sports are already seeing shortened seasons. We know that deer ticks are moving up and other pestilence are coming in, and agriculture is being threatened. But let's celebrate a lot of what's happened recently. We can look at this graph of where this is average annual spending in billions on climate. And you can see where we were in the 90s, and then in the next decade grew a little bit, and then now we're actually seeing a bit more in the coming out of the Great Recession, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. That's even better. And now what we've procured in the past just couple of 3 years, everyone's been talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, but there's also the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act, which is really about making sure we adopt policies to make sure our information technology is born here in this country. But that had a lot of climate provisions installed with it, both overtly and covertly, because a lot of stuff, if we're importing, where we're manufacturing our information technologies, the creation of a lot of that manufacturing coming back here, where it's a lot more carbon efficient to build things, it's actually going to have a big carbon climate effect. And then, of course, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which we're now seeing a lot of money coming through. So this is all great stuff to celebrate. Another thing to celebrate, you can just see here, the past 20 years of where our new energy, electricity capacity, regenerating capacity is coming from for the past 22, 23 years. You can see back at the turn of the century, this was dominated by new natural gas, particularly with the fracking boom that was happening. You can see the beginnings of some windmill stuff, this green portion here. Of course, coal grew in this decade around 2010, or 5 years, I guess, gap. But you can see also, look at how much more wind is coming on. And then solar really starts taking off about 10 years ago. And you can see battery storage is kind of ramping up. So this is all good news. This is where the new capacity is coming from, a lot more variety and a lot less dependence on fossil fuels. So all good news to celebrate. We'll start off with, we're kind of making a tough news sandwich. We're going to have good news at the beginning and good news at the end. But we obviously need a lot more done, because this is a kind of a trajectory of where US carbon emissions have been in the past 20 years or so. And so a lot of people surprised, the US is actually bringing our carbon emissions down from their peak, which was both 1990 and 2005 were about their peak, I guess, but through those years. And you can see in fits and starts, you can actually see where the Great Recession happened, where we really lost a lot of, a downward spike here, and then COVID was even bigger. But of course, we're ramping back up again as the economy reemerges. And then here's where we were without those policies, this blue trajectory between, of our emissions reductions. And with the Inflation Reduction Act and other things, we can see we can be in this trajectory. But of course, we have been aiming since the mid-90s, we've been trying to adopt some sort of intergovernmental agreement, global agreement on where emissions need to be that's fair and just for the planet. And in 2015, of course, we adopted the Paris Protocol Agreement, and which mirrors very well President Biden's ambitious plans to get to 50% decarbonization by 2030. And you can see, yes, we're moving in the right direction, but we have a lot more work to do if we're going to get this in this pivotal decade. And we'll explore exactly why this decade is. You can see it very well in that En-ROADS model. So good news, but there's more to do. Now I'm going to switch over actually to the En-ROADS model. Now, I'm just learning that the new Zoom no longer allows me to just share from switching my toggle. I have to actually go from PowerPoint to, just a moment here. There we go. I'm just resharing my screen so that I can share the En-ROADS model. So En-ROADS, if you're seeing this now, speak up if you can't, but En-ROADS is a really fascinating tool that I really encourage you, after this recording is done, or if you're curious about it, take a stab at it. It's free and online, and it's consistently and periodically being updated with the latest information about where climate is going, but also where the latest science on where our energy is coming from and international policy, and the rapid transitions that are happening with how the world is supplying its energy and transportation and building industry efficiency and electrification. All that stuff is kind of incorporated. So when we're going to kind of just do a very back of the envelope kind of look at this, but what we're looking at here is where temperature change has been from 2000, where we were at 0.83 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. So that's how much warming had happened from the Industrial Revolution to 23 years ago. And this is a global average, right? There are regions that are doing faster than this in the planet. There's also regions in the planet going slower than this or warming up less. And you can see where we are now. 2023, we're at about 1.3 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And with business as usual, which is what we're trajectorying here, we just keep on getting up to about 3.6 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, which is 6.4 Fahrenheit, if you prefer that. I am going to keep on centigrade just because it keeps these nice dashed lines across here, which if you don't know, 1.5 and 2.0 degrees, that is where the IPCC says we need to stay below. First at 1.5. If we don't stay below that, we'll start seeing some feedback loops where we will no longer control much of what's going on with the climate, because we will, a popular cited feedback loop would be like the thawing of the Arctic permafrost, which releases methane. So as the world gets warmer, there's more methane being released in the permafrost up in the Arctic, which continues to warm. They've got this feedback loop. So we're trying to avoid this by staying below that 1.5. And then now there's also scientific, or perhaps we're looking, since it looks like we're going to blow by that as a global average by the end of the decade, perhaps 2 degrees will be okay. Any incremental bending of this curve down is a positive move, and the more we can do, the better. It's like diet or exercise. The sooner we do it and the more aggressive we do this, the better results we'll see. So that's global temperature on this side. And then on this side is where a lot of this is coming from. So where we're supplying our energy. So in red, you can see is oil. That's the red line, not in the past 23 years of history, and then the next 77 years getting us out to the end of the model at 2100. And this is just what we expect to have happened according to the research that is going into this. There's also coal is the black line, which is the most plentiful fossil fuel globally and the dirtiest. We should be really worried about that one. And then natural gas, which has a lot less carbon content, but does have methane associated. If it's leaking, we don't keep track of that. Then we have renewables, this green line, which I really like seeing the fact that has a steep up climb, even without any other policy towards the end of the century. We're seeing it rival our other sources. Then we have bioenergy rather, in this pinkish color, magenta color, nuclear kind of here on the bottom. This is old-fashioned existing nuclear technology, and this doesn't really incorporate like next generation nuclear technology, which is really being explored aggressively in places like Europe, or we had this big breakthrough a couple months ago with nuclear fusion, which has no nuclear byproduct, of course. And as that comes on, that would fall into this last category, which is new zero carbon emissions fuel. So that's like something out of, like I said, nuclear fusion, which is just on the brink of being explored, but also things from, imagine a sci-fi novel, imagine the flux capacitor or vibranium, right? That's what's going in that category. So each of these toggles we can play with and dictate, and we'll explore these together about, where this dot is shows us that we can do a whole lot more to disincentivize coal, and God forbid we could do a little bit more to incentivize coal. And same thing with renewables. Actually, we're doing quite a bit, but we could do a lot more. If you want to dig into actually where instead of just a qualitative look, but a quantitative look, we could click on these 3 dots and explore these numbers here that they kind of give for each one of these. We don't really have time to do that too much, but we may click on these dots to give a more fine-tuned profile of how we're going to make a policy. But this is basically our energy supply. This is policy that dictates the supply of our energy. And again, when I slide this left, if I slide coal left, I'm not waving a magic wand and making coal go away. I am using this is a market-based model using 1,600 different algorithms and equations that are all complementary and interrelated, so that it's really talking about incentives or disincentives, like taxes, or you could actually, do a number of different things through this, but we're just basically disincentivizing it in a broad stroke. So that's where our energy is coming from. And then this is the demand side, how we're using our energy. So transportation, the efficiency of our vehicles, or the electrifying our vehicles, which is a big topic of conversation, of course, recently. Huge category here, building and industry, energy efficiency and electrification. So that's enormous stuff. We can talk about making our buildings more, and industry energy efficient and electrifying it. Global population growth and economic growth. I'm not sure how much we want to play around with that, except it's not so much policy, but as like perhaps as we're learning, a lot of fertility rates in a lot of parts of the world are actually falling faster than had previously been expected. So this again defers to where the UN thinks we're going, and that's constantly updated. But we can play with that. And then land and emissions use, so the rate at which we're cutting down the world's forests, that's deforestation, which is a natural carbon sink, right? And then methane, which is the number 2 gas of concern, greenhouse gas of concern. It's actually much more potent than carbon dioxide, but there's much smaller traces of it put into the atmosphere compared to carbon dioxide. So overall, it's number 2. And then carbon removal, which quite frankly, we're going to have to start taking a serious look at as the years go on, and this gets more and more desperate to bend this curve down. So afforestation is just what it sounds like, planting a lot of trees around the world. And then technological carbon removal has a number, I think it has 5 different categories here, which are kind of fascinating, and these are interesting to explore. But basically, there's bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which is like, for an example of that is like seeding the oceans to make more algae, which sequester carbon and then sink to the ocean floor. Direct air capture is like traditional HVAC equipment, but designed to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, which is terribly cost ineffective right now, but they're working on it in Europe, and who knows, it may have breakthroughs to make it affordable. Enhanced mineralization is like chemical processes that could be made more aggressive in order to create like limestone and such things like that, to kind of use atmospheric carbon that way. And then there's agricultural soil sequestration, and biochar are kind of like agricultural practices that could use soil as a carbon sink. So all of these different things, I'm kind of giving a very quick explanation of all this stuff. I'm not even showing you, you can see if I click here, all of these different things we could model, from sea level rise. We're currently looking at temperature increase, cost of electricity, the cost of energy in general, net greenhouse gas emissions. We could look at, I will probably look at this at some point, which is greenhouse gas emissions by type of gas. So you can see here, I mentioned that methane is number 2. That's that CH4 light blue wedge there, which does grow over the course of the century unless we do something about it. But energy CO2 is this charcoal gray, the CO2 released when we burn fossil fuels to create our energy. And then we've got traces of nitrous oxide and other F gases and land use stuff that's kind of hugging the bottom. But you can see how that charcoal gray kind of dominates things. So in a nutshell, that's what we're looking at here. And you can also go through and adjust the assumptions if you want to push back on saying, well, perhaps the UN is wrong about certain things. We can actually look at that, and it's fascinating to look at. But I would like to, if it's okay, John, open the floor and see if folks have some things that they are hearing in the news, or they read about, or they're curious about, and they want to see how this model portrays those energy efficiency or electrification or basically broad climate policies to try to get us to where we need to be. And I would say one last thing, remember that this is a global model. So what may be really good for New Hampshire or Maine or our quarter of the country, or our country even, may not be good when extrapolated over the entire world. So, or may not have the same effects you might imagine. So with that, does anybody have anything you could expose? You can put it in the chat. If you wanted to offer something, if everyone's bashful, I'd be happy to offer what I know are like the top 3 proposed policies that people like to see.
Peter, are we allowed to just ask? Oh, there we go.
Sure, please do.
I see hands up first.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I heard that our military is like a top source of greenhouse emissions in the world, like one of the top 10 sources in the whole world. Is that accurate?
You know, I'm no expert on that. I might, from what I understand, I don't know if that's true. And it's hard for the model like this to kind of break down all the different things the military does, right? Because we're talking about transportation. We're also talking about a lot of different things for where the military is getting its energy. Yes, they do burn a lot of oil and natural gas, obviously, but they also have nuclear submarines and stuff, and they are doing a lot of things, particularly as they're in remote places where it's hard to get a hold of fuel, that they're switching to renewables, and they're kind of, you know, a lot of the research and development parts of the military are kind of groundbreaking. So we have a lot of them to owe for the investment that they're doing in renewables. But I don't actually know the breakdown of that stat. I have heard it quoted before, but I have to defer to somebody else on that one. I'd have to look it up. What is a policy we could kind of take a look at? And if I could get us started, if you want to hear what I hear is one of the more popular ones.
There's one more hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I can't really see that with my screen occupied with this.
Hey, Peter, this is a wonderful tool. My question is, and I think it's you can get to find you can do this within the tool itself, but the one thing I'm very interested in is the barriers to entry. Like, so for example, renewables, and I see that green line, it's projecting to increase considerably, but even in New Hampshire, right, the cost for solar, the cost for an electric car, the cost for a heat pump, and I'm going through the process right now as a consumer, and so I can give you a ballpark, you know, just real quick, like a modest sized house, 1,800 square feet, it's going to be give or take about $25,000 after rebates. To buy an electric car is about $45,000, and to put a heat pump in your home ranges anywhere from $20,000 to $25,000. So you're looking at $90,000, and to me, it's worth doing because of the ROI that you're going to get. But I think for lots of people, that's a barrier to entry, and I'm curious if this model takes that into consideration, like
Yeah,
the
that's
cost.
a great question. Yeah, and in fact, so yeah, I don't know how different Maine is from New Hampshire on this. I'd have to defer to John, and also the previous questioner, who I know exactly where I'm going to go looking for how much the military has as a carbon footprint, and I can follow up if we keep track of that. But to answer your question, if you were to actually look at the spot where you would look is under, under here.
Okay.
Under the assumptions, you could actually look at the progress ratio, which is the rate in which, and this is the part that's actually changed. When I first started using this model for our lobbying and advocacy, we knew that it actually showed that the expected temperature increases by the end of 2100 was going to be 4.1 degrees centigrade. So there's some additional good news, is that and a lot of that is changed because there's a number of reasons why they changed it. And I went through the trainings to re-upped my training to know about it. But a lot of it was just because renewables were getting so much cheaper, so much faster than had been thought just 4 years ago. But you're right, there's still cost barriers for a lot of that stuff. We can actually adjust some of those things. Progress ratio is just the rate at which new doubling of investment or market share will decrease cost. So I can actually look at that for renewables, for instance, and move this over. A lot of times it doesn't, whoops, I went in the wrong direction. If I go in this direction, you can see like this gives me the scope of what they're saying is possible. Now, I would actually, so I want to kind of, if it's okay, I do want to have a robust Q&A, but I want to like look at particular policies, and we might see exactly how this model works. Because what I would say, I would push a little bit on the numbers about that. We have a lot, one of the other things we have to be thankful for is that by the stipulation that the federal tax credits associated, for instance, I know that there's hefty distribution of tax and incentives nationally and statewide for energy, for heat pumps, but for instance, electric vehicles, because you had to be under $30,000 with your vehicle in order to get an electric vehicle, qualify for the 7,500 tax rebate federally for a new and 4,000 for a used vehicle. It drove down the prices a lot. If you actually look online, you'll see a lot more new electric vehicles for $29,900 or something like that to just qualify. So then you take if you include that $7,500, it brings you down to 23,500 or 4,000. I just bought an all-electric Chevy Bolt in New Hampshire, in Rochester, New Hampshire. That was 30,000 miles on a 2020 Chevy Bolt. For after the tax rebate, it's at $19,000. So these are falling fast.
That's good. Yeah.
But let's actually explore that, because I don't want to make myself. This is the part where I'm going to make myself more humble about my snazzy investment of an electric vehicle, which are really fun to drive, by the way. But if I were to grab this, and let's just assume this, because I want to get us started on the policies. If I actually, because the modeling of this, if I were just solely concerned with, I think electric vehicles are going to do it all. If I grab this, you may want to think about what happens in real time to where our energy is coming from, and how we're using it, and also what it's going to mean for global temperature, expected global temperature increases. So if I grab this and just slide this, now I'm maximizing incentives for electric vehicles across the globe. So boom. Did people see how that moved?
Mm-hmm.
Let me do that again. So I'll slide this over. Now, take a look. Obviously, the red line where oil is, which means petrol, goes down, right? We like that. We also like the fact that the green line is going up. But what else is, and then we've shaved off 0.2 of a degree from expected global temperature increases, which you may think that's modest. And one of the reasons why it might be modest is because of what's happening on the left. Can you see what might be digging into expected temperature savings? I'll keep doing it over and over again. What else is moving in the wrong direction?
Coal increased.
Exactly. Thank you, whoever said that. Exactly. So as we move, if we're asking for just more electric vehicles and accelerating that transition, if for most, we're lucky in New England and in the United States in general, mostly, to have a relatively clean grid compared to other parts of the world. But if we're asking for more electric vehicles for a lot of parts of the world, where's that electricity coming from? But coal, particularly in like Southeast Asia and places, developing countries. So that's kind of a policy that puts into perspective how any one single policy. We have a lot of things to do, but in the trainings they say we're not going to be able to do this with us. There is no silver bullet. There's only silver buckshot. We need a lot of things to go right in order to stabilize the climate. So what's another policy I might be able to put in place?
Jerry has the same.
Yeah, so Peter, you've been asked about if we all became vegetarian as a policy, afforestation. I'm just reading from the chat.
That sounds great. Let's start with those two, because I've got a very, I probably won't remember much more than two. I'll be lucky if I remember two. So so methane is really, it's hard because we're talking about changing our diets. A lot of what we're talking about with going vegetarian is the release of methane. It's not all in there. You have to kind of like weasel other parts of it down, particularly because there is carbon intensivity to like trucking around beef and all that stuff. But a lot of it is, and I'm going to switch from temperature change to where our CO2 emissions are greenhouse gas by gas. So again, the charcoal gray is the one we're worried about most. But if I go to methane and other gases, and I talk about, I could just like slide this whole thing over, or I could break this down between agricultural methane and leaky natural gas pipelines. But let's just say this is for our purposes. Let's just slide this all the way down. You see what happened there? We didn't change where our energy is coming from, notice. But by sliding this down, we really put a kibosh on that blue wedge there. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't know about. Methane has been significantly addressed in the recent national policy that have been passed, because We actually put a price on methane emissions that will increase over time, which shows, we'll probably get back to that, but it shows that they're very concerned with this and that they realize that mechanism. So that's a great one. Look how much that did, quite a bit. Now, again, that's doesn't get us to that magic 2-degree number, but it's pretty close. Let's talk about afforestation was the other one I was mentioned. Planting trees is something that's really important. Obviously, we're right now, that green line that hugs the bottom here, that's actually land use CO2. So you know, think about it, but the land and all the trees and everything that grows on it either sucks carbon in as a sink or emits carbon. And actually, even though the United States is a net carbon sink in our land, globally, because of how we've mismanaged forests around the world, we actually are a net emitter. Land is a net emitter globally. So if we actually planted trees, if I grab this, and again, just to see what it looks like, just to test the model a bit, and I move this from emitting 2 2.75 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere, it's now sequestering, see the negative sign there, 3.75 roughly gigatons of CO2, which is great. A big step of like 6 gigatons in the right direction, which is wonderful. You can see that it kind of, oh, well, let's actually add to that, slowing down the rate at which we're cutting down the forest, right? Because those obviously would go in hand in hand. Now, there's some equity problems about this, like where are we going to plant these forests? Which Bangladeshi subsistence farmer are we going to kick off his land to plant these mangroves, or whatever it might be? You know, there's going to be tricky to do this, but we've got from 3.6 in the bad direction to 6.6 in the right direction. Is like a 10 gigaton swing in the right direction. All wonderful, but you can see how it's still, and this is why I love En-ROADS, because it really shows visually how, yes, this is great, but we need more. We really need to address where the energy is coming from, because we're still overwhelmed by the amount of CO2 being pumped into the atmosphere. And I should say, I didn't mention this before, I am reverting to business as usual between each one of these little explorations of policy, because once you start patching policies together and augmenting it, there's kind of like it gets complicated because there's redundancies and interactions between the policies. You actually get to see best if you look at the policy A and then wipe it clean and then look at policy B, not policy A plus B at the beginning, but we'll get there. What else? I should say that there's a citizens climate lobby. When we're talking about forestry, that is a big concern, particularly something that Maine and New Hampshire and a lot of New England states, one of the secondary asks that citizens climate lobby is working on is getting our lawmakers to adopt good trade practices that discourage and penalize our trade partners internationally for deforestation of really essential forestry, which is going to be a huge benefit for our states where we have who are currently at trade, they're at a disadvantage against cheap imports.
Peter, Autumn would love to see a push for increasing nuclear power and renewable energy sources. So
Great.
maybe 2 policies at once.
That sounds great. Okay, so let's do renewables first. So if we were, again, globally going to highly incentivize, we're not waving a magic wand and making renewables everywhere. We're just going to incentivize renewables. If I slide this all the way over, you can see, I love seeing that green line go up, and now it's the market leader by 2100, which is wonderful. And you can see that wedge of carbon emissions has gotten lowered. Now, the thing that's really important about this, and this is again why I really, when I was doing presentations before En-ROADS was public and available, it really was hard to explain to people why Citizens Climate Lobby Volunteers, the 250,000 nonpartisan grassroots organization, was pushing for certain policies above others. This really shows the limits of even incentivizing renewables. This is really important, and this is a lot of what was just recently passed was promoting the production as we're trying to switch to a renewables heavy future or a clean energy future. But you can see that even if we make it much, much cheaper using tax structures or incentives of some sort to move towards renewables, oil and natural gas and most problematic coal will keep part of the market. I go back to zero, look where coal is. And if I, so it's kind of a gradual increase as the world asks for more and more energy. If I slide renewables all the way over, it goes down, particularly in mid-century. But what happens, just thinking, instead of like a concerned climate advocate, think more of an economist. What happens as we make renewable energy, wind, solar, tidal, and hydro, we make it much, much cheaper. What happens to the coal that's used to be going to market? The price of no one's using it. What happens when no one uses it? What happens to the price? The price goes down. What happens when the price goes down low enough? Well, people start buying it again. And that's why there's this economic rebound effect, and it starts taking up market share again. Same thing happens coincidentally with nuclear. If I actually grab this, now remember, this is old-fashioned, big, bulky Seabrook kind of nuclear power plants. And if I slide these over, you can see that little wedge that grew on the bottom, it slid up. And I will actually do this because it's a more proper approximation. From what is going on in Europe and other parts of the world where there's real big boom in investment in research and tech and design with next generation nuclear. If I actually couple that with this new net zero, I did both of these, you can see, yes, now that nuclear is really climbing, but again, it's eating a lot, it's competing a lot, not just with coal and oil and natural gas, but also with renewables, right? So it's kind of hard to trust that our future will be in good hands. I mean, I'm all of these things, none of these things are to say that like, oh, we've only shaved 0.2 of a degree off of the temperature. It's not worth doing. By all means, all these things are very much worth doing, but you can see the limits of any one of these single policies.
Peter,
I
could you
know
please
that-
do renewables plus nuclear plus new zero carbon?
Of course. So here we go. So this is, this is maximizing the incentives for renewables, for old-fashioned nuclear, and for next generation nuclear. And that's kind of like, that might be a little bit loose with this because new zero carbon, they're probably considering other things besides fusion there. But so I don't know about you. When I used to have this great joke before Zoom allowed me to do this. I'm going to try to do this and just stop my show. First time I looked at En-ROADS, I was kind of and I saw what it was sharing with this information. I don't know about you, but I had the experience that I remember from watching this episode of The Simpsons. I hope you guys don't mind for a little bit of comedic relief here. As you know, this is where Homer goes to church, and this is where Homer goes to drink beer. And in a very famous episode, when Simpsons realize it's going to get squashed by a Armageddon-sized asteroid, this is what happens. And this was my reaction. So I don't want that to be our reaction. So I'm going to hope that we can do better than that. So getting back to what I would like to do now is actually, I know we have plenty of questions and chat, but I want to switch hats and talk about why John Gage and I and other folks and 250,000 volunteers around the country are working so hard on a particular policy, which was to join every other developed nation in the world and adopt some sort of carbon price in the United States. So if I were to actually go to this model now, I've zeroed it out to business as usual. And if we were to model the policy that had been co-sponsored by the record amount, most co-sponsored climate bill in history, the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, which we hear will be reintroduced in this Congress as well, started off at $15 a ton of CO2, which is the equivalent at about like 11 cents on a gallon of gas at the gas station. And every year, let's say going up this year, it keeps going up by $10 a year, so that by the end of the century, 77 years from now, and we're going to start increasing this immediately, like as soon as it starts, goes up $10 a year, which is $10 times 77 years is 770 plus the initial $15 goes up this way. Now, this is actually conservative because it could climb faster if we don't hit certain earmarks. But you can see how this price on carbon yes, it doesn't get us to all the way where we need to be, but look what it did. It did, not only did it really boost renewables, but it put a big squash on the market availability for coal, oil, and natural gas. And you can see here where by the end of the century, we have very, very small amounts of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere. And if we couple that with a methane policy, similar to actually what we kind of passed, but get really strict about methane, we can get us down close to that magic 2-degree number. So that's the good news I want to hope for you. And that's, and at this point, what I really, if you don't take anything away from the En-ROADS model, I would challenge you to see if you could get anything as profound an effect as the single policy of carbon pricing. The nice thing about it is that it does both incentivizing the good stuff like clean energy for renewables, but also, most importantly, also disincentivizes coal, oil, and natural gas. Remember, we incentivized renewables, nuclear, and new zero carbon all at the same time, and we got ourselves down to 3.3 degrees centigrade, because coal, oil, and natural gas is always going to keep some market share unless we put a mechanism in place. We bring in that extra economic externality and price carbon so that it'll stay out of, and it works across the entire economy. And then after this, when we start doing things like planting trees or absorbing some of that technological, or cutting down the rates at which we're slowing down the world's forests, we get closer to that magic 1.5 degree number. And look how easy that was after moving that carbon price in place. So that's, in a nutshell, why Citizens Climate Lobby is working so hard on this. But I will, there's a number of questions that I want to address before we get to actual proper Q&A, which is, well, there's so many different kinds of carbon pricing, and isn't that going to be hurtful to the folks who are at the bottom of the economic spectrum who are just trying to make ends meet? And we have there's a number of different policies. We're very strong supporters of what our neighbors to the north in Canada do, which carbon pricing is the umbrella term. We like what they have, which is cash back carbon pricing, which means that any money coming in for or assigned to the cost of the emissions gets immediately returned into an equal periodic dividend check to every man, woman, and child in the Canadian provinces that are participating. So if that, I'm going to leave this model, but we will come back to it if we want, if you have questions about it. But let me just move on to just talk a little bit about the slideshow that I want to show you about exactly why we are hopeful, and why we, not only does this do wonders for the environment, but it actually provides net benefits for those folks who are on the lower and middle income levels. So again, this is what we're talking about: charging a fee, a gradually increasing fee on the fossil fuels where they start. So the coal mine, the oil refinery, or the gas pipeline, or the port of entry, and turned into a net 100% revenue. Net revenue is divided evenly by the population and distributed. If you're under 18, you get half a dividend check. And again, we are told that when the negotiations were going on in Congress last summer, where John and others were working so hard to move our lawmakers in the right direction, we were told that we had 49 of the 50 necessary senators to put some sort of carbon price in place. If you were to just reimburse folks as capital gains tax reimbursements, or as income tax or payroll tax reimbursements, you can see it's roughly flat. This is the poorest 20%. This is the richest 20%. You can see it's flat or roughly regressive. If you just give it back as a lump sum rebate, seen here, you can see how this is a huge benefit for the folks at the bottom 20%, and everybody below 60% actually is a net benefit benefiter. And then the top 40%, yes, they'll have to pay a little bit more, but it's less than 2% of their income. And don't forget, these are the folks who have the most money, so they have the easiest means of buying that electric vehicle, or buying into the solar farm, or changing their consuming habits wherever they might be in order to change to make it beneficial. Instead of having to rely on our research about what's the right car to buy that's best for the planet, or where do I get my food done, shopped for, other kinds of purchases, it's all embedded in the same tool that we use to make all of our other decisions, which is the cost. And really what it's mostly, it's actually, for time's sake, I'm going to skip this because this just shows the same thing. My point is that in rural parts of our state in Maine actually do better with this policy according to the economics. A higher percentage of households benefit from the policy than the wealthier parts of the state. And I'm sure it's the same thing in New Hampshire. And you can see again that folks, this is now broken down income brackets by 10%. It's everybody under 70% or so, breaks even or makes money. And the poorer you are, the better off you do. And again, the richest folks have the easiest means of decarbonizing. This is what this policy, this is again the same thing, but broken down in real numbers for what it would be in its first year. And as the fee increases, this gulf between what you'd be expecting to pay out in added costs just because your oil, gas, and coal is getting more expensive. So that means products that rely on those are going to get slightly more expensive until those companies decarbonize. But the dividend check that you're getting back exceeds that. This is, no one's getting rich off of this in the first year, but of course these gulfs grow. And again, everybody underneath 60% benefits. And again, it's not, no one's going to go broke per year in the top brackets, even though they're, $550 in the red. But the real reason why I like this slide is because it shows what everyone thinks about when they think about carbon pricing is the cost of gas for their car, heating oil, and coal, which is the dark blue, the direct energy costs here, dark blue. For everybody, and the richer you are, the more this is true. The real carbon footprint or the carbon costs are in what's called indirect energy costs or are embedded carbon costs, which is the stuff you wouldn't think about having a carbon content, like me getting a cup of coffee in the morning, or getting that Amazon package shipped to me and dropped off at my door, or taking a photo on my phone and uploading it to the cloud. All of these things have a carbon cost associated, but there's just so many middlemen. It's very hard to track down and assign a cost for each one of those with any other system, except for putting a cost on the carbon where it first enters the economy. You may ask, well, where has this worked? And the answer is everywhere it's been tried. Our favorite example, as I said before, is Canada, which for 7 years had British Columbia as the trailblazer with this policy. They were all given a mandate to figure out different ways to decarbonize. And British Columbia, in the 7 years from 2007 to 2014, adopted the policy. In those years, British Columbia's petroleum consumption went down faster than the Canadian average, while its economic growth actually was faster than the Canadian average. So decoupling our old myth that we need carbon emissions to have a strong economy. In fact, Canada has been, British Columbia was such a success and so popular and survived 2 referendums because those dividends supplied real assets to folks who needed them at the bottom of the economic scale, that it became the default backstop policy for all the Canadian provinces, unless they had one policy before. So Quebec had a cap and trade policy before, so they don't have this, but New Brunswick, for instance, does because they had no policy before. More economists have support this idea of cashback carbon pricing. It's now up to 3,640 economists. Last time I checked a few weeks ago. We're always adding new ones. And it's basically because, yes, again, it doesn't do everything, but it's the most effective and most equitable first step. And we can, our national lawmakers are paying attention to this, particularly when it's coming from business folks who are supporting it. More on that in a second. Another reason why carbon cashback is a great policy is because it's impervious to judicial review. There's a lot of concern about Supreme Court that looks skeptically at regulatory policies where they think it's an executive branch overreach, where the EPA was not mandated to keep inventory of carbon dioxide. So are we overstepping by giving that to the EPA? Well, if we look at the Constitution, it couldn't be clear that Congress has the explicit control over collecting revenue and distributing funds. So when if the legislature were to pass this, its originalist arguments would slide right off of this one, because the Constitution couldn't be clearer about what power belongs to the legislature. I'm going kind of quickly because I want to get to your questions, and also John has things to share with us as well. But Luntz Polling, which is a conservative polling group, has shown that there's broad support for this when explained to folks from both parties. So this is a few years old now, but when explained to Democrats, this policy, a very high percentage, 80% of Democrats support this policy because it's effective and equitable. And surprisingly to some perhaps is that for the Republicans under 40 years old, it's almost the same. It's 75%. So nearly this universal support amongst those two groups. And this is where things get really interesting, is that we feel that carbon pricing is, in fact, John wrote a beautiful article in the Green Energy Times. Am I getting the name of that publication right? That comes out of Vermont.
Yes.
That about this is an inevitability. As I said before, the US is the only developed nation without some sort of carbon price. We share that distinction with other gray countries on this map, like Belarus and Russia and Yemen and Libya. Geography quiz, we can find them all. Now, but we're the only one that's a developed nation that meets the criteria as a developed nation. The UK and the EU, and we suspect Canada soon afterwards, are very anxious to decarbonize as fast as they can. Particularly, they're learning the hard way why the foreign policy problems that when you take a blind eye and just keep importing cheap oil from authoritarian regimes in Russia and Saudi Arabia and other places. So they want to aggressively increase their carbon price, which they have. They have layered carbon pricing because different countries have additional carbon pricing. In fact, so the North European countries have like I think over $150 equivalent or exchange rate, $150 equivalents on their tons of CO2 emitted. China has a carbon price, surprisingly, but it's only $5 per CO2 emitted. So what they're doing is they want to increase their carbon price to decarbonize their industries and their economy. But they are worried about doing that with and forcing their companies that do business within the EU to just leave for countries where it's free to pollute our common atmosphere, which is Russia, Belarus, and the United States. So they have installed what's called carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which is starting this year, which is just a fancy word for carbon tariffs on imports coming from markets that either have no carbon price, like Russia and Belarus, and the United States, or have a carbon price that's far too low, and they'll do the difference between the carbon price they have and their trading partner, which like China. So what that's going to do is protect their industry to make sure that there's no incentive for them to stay home. But what it's most important is that, and this is where I'm really excited, particularly for where our main senators and representatives are, because it is going to really ratchet up the pressure for the United States and the other countries that remain out of the carbon pricing club to start pricing their carbon, which is making the policy international. Since they've announced this, China has actually expanded its carbon price, both in terms of sectors of the economy, and they're talking about ramping up the price. Even Russia has talked about installing a carbon price. The US, you can imagine what's going to happen when we try to export our wood products or something, steel to the EU, and we're competing with Canadian steel, which actually doesn't have that tariff applied to it. So it's going to be much cheaper, and it's going to be because it's participating in the carbon market. And there's a business advantage for that. So one of the reasons why a lot of conservatives are very excited about the possibilities in this, in fact, there are some very conservative national senators who are really interested in this border carbon adjustment mechanism, because the US actually has a latent business advantage that we're not harvesting we're not monetizing that. We actually can make most of our goods and services at a much smaller carbon footprint than our trading partners. The only place in the world that has a better average carbon price per good or service is the EU and UK. But we're more carbon efficient than Canada and Mexico. We're more than three times more carbon efficient than our Chinese trading partners, nearly 4 times more carbon efficient than India, and more than 4 times more carbon efficient than Russia, showing that it's like, this is a a win-win-win if we are to adopt this, because this is great for business, great for the economy, great for people if there's dividends going to folks, and of course, great for the environment.
Hey, Peter, this is
Yes.
terrific. We had a question. Could you go back to En-ROADS on the cost of energy and what some of the policies do? And that was actually the one thing that I was going to ask you to show also.
Sure.
If you could model carbon fee and dividend, the Energy Innovation Act policy, and then add some other complementary policies to get us to 1.5.
Okay, here we are.
Great. Ooh, we're almost there.
Let me do
How about a
more.
little
Sorry.
building efficiency or
yes.
something?
Yeah, great.
There we go. Terrific. So in the left graph, can we show the cost of energy, the total cost of energy,
Yes.
which is
Yeah,
under the,
so I could actually go right here and say the cost of energy goes up there. Now, you may think if this carbon price, remember the carbon price looks like this, just keeps on ramping up. Boom, 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 boom. But because, and it's not just because of consumer pressure, it's because businesses, which are much more sensitive to price fluctuations, are going to either have to innovate because they know that this is a persistent and predictable increase in price. They're going to move away from carbon emissions, or they're going to fall victim to their competitors who figured out a better way to do this, using the markets to our climate advantage. So even though the price keeps on going up till by the end of the century, what are we at? 800, what we figured out already, $785 per ton of CO2. But yet it's not reflected in this because by this point, we're getting less and less of our energy from that CO2. And remember, this gulf is what it would be without giving that dividend check back.
and okay, so
is,
instead of cost of energy, can you show total cost of energy, which is under financial at the bottom?
oh, okay, sorry, going back.
It's the last one,
Yes.
right? Okay, and then on the right-hand side, the revenue generated from the carbon price. Which
Yes,
is-
okay. Well, you might have to help me on this one.
That's in financial near the top, the third one down.
Oh yeah, revenue generated. Yep.
So the reason that I love to show people this one is there's no point where the total annual cost of energy exceeds the revenue that's being generated. In fact, when the total annual cost of energy is at its highest over the base case, $1 trillion more is still being raised from the carbon price. In other words, even for the 3 decades when energy is more expensive, the total cost of energy is more expensive, we are raising well more than we need to be able to compensate people for more than the cost of energy from this policy mix. And then you see at the end, the total cost of energy in the base case keeps going up, but with this clean energy policy mix and energy efficiency, it's nearly, it's about 25% less than the base case. So, it makes, we want cheap, abundant energy. And so this is how we get cheap, abundant energy and help families afford the transition. I think these two
John.
graphs really show it.
I love it.
Thank you, Wharton, for asking that question.
Yes, good source. I'm going to toggle, if it's okay, I'm just going to toggle right back just because I've got a couple of bang up slides just to finish with, if that's okay, John.
Did anybody have any more En-ROADS questions just before we? Okay, great. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, of course. Again, I'm sorry that I have to keep on going back and forth between unshare and then share again. But here we are. So this has been supported by a bunch of different businesses. I'll be quick because I know I want to turn this over to John. You can see all these many different groups from not just businesses, but different kinds of environmental groups, conservative groups, religious organizations, Rotarians, fraternal organizations, all kinds of things. All right, so I'm going to end, well, not quite end with this, but CCL has recently adopted other policies. I mentioned healthy forests before. I also mentioned energy and efficiency and electrification. If we were actually just looking at a comparative model, if you were curious about how En-ROADS compares with other models, we can look at this, which is, again, this is where US global emissions. So this is not a global model like En-ROADS. This is a US based model from the repeat model from Princeton. You can see, yes, we've got in fits and starts, our CO2 emissions are going down, and we need to get to this dotted line by 2030. So we've got work to do. With what just recently happened with the current the recent, like the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the bipartisan infrastructure law got us to 28% reduction by 2030, which is great, but it's not 50%. Now, you may have read that we needed 40%, that the laws passed got us to 40%. That's if everything goes right, and there's a bottleneck associated with this about clean energy permitting reform. We have to bring more grid capacity to allow for this clean energy to come into play. And if we did a couple of that, then we get to that 40% reduction. Now, where does carbon pricing come in on this? Well, if we add carbon pricing to this, then we exceed that 50% reduction. This is just up till 2030. So this is only like 7 years of this, but you can see how important this is to get to. And why stop there? CCL's volunteers have decided to also adopt policies about healthy forests to actually absorb some of that carbon. And then, of course, there will be some energy efficiency and electrification associated with just the carbon pricing, of course. But if we do additional policies, we'll get down to 60%, exceeding that goal of 50% by 10%. So that's very exciting news to know that that much is possible if we do enough to convince our lawmakers on the national level to adopt these policies. So, just a reminder of why we're doing this. This is US carbon emissions over the past 100 years. We're number one. We, share this with the usual suspects with Europe and Russia and China. And of course, if you look at the developing parts of the world, they're the ones who are least culpable or least responsible for this issue. And yet they're the ones taking it on the chin with more than 150,000 climate change related deaths per year. And that this is going to, of course, grow unless we do a lot of work, including adding a lot more to the United States and other parts of the world. And I'll just end with these real quick pictures of what we do. So this is us meeting with our lawmakers. That's my daughter thanking First District Representative Shelley Pingree when she became one of the original co-sponsors of the carbon fee and dividend bill. This is us meeting with Susan Collins in fall of 2019. This is us meeting Angus King a number of times. We really appreciate we meet with we have presences in every congressional district, and we've met with every lawmaker we can, and we really appreciate they find us very appreciative, really good lobbyists and informed, and they love hearing about us, particularly from folks who are concerned, who are not professionals. So if you are interested, I would very much hope that you could test out your phone's QR code and scan this and get information about CCL. And James Hansen, I'll end with his quote. Most impressive, James Hansen was the NASA scientist who in 1988 first testified before Congress to talk about the threat of climate change. And he got Tennessee Senator Al Gore obsessing about it ever since. But he says, most impressive is the work of Citizens Climate Lobby. If you want to join the fight to save the planet, to save creation for your grandchildren, there is no more effective step you can take than to becoming an active member of this group. And this is a picture of us down in DC. If you are interested in, we would love your support with just a 30-second phone call or an email to our very influential lawmakers of all parties. And or if you want to go a little further, you could join a proper group and learn more about how to get endorsements from business and communities and faith leaders in your area. And if you wanted to go full hog, we welcome you to come to DC with us to meet with our lawmakers in June 11th through 13th for the annual conference in DC meeting. And there's my information if you have more questions, but there's that QR code again, but feel free to open up questions. And I know, John, I really want to make sure that you got a chance to share what you wanted to share.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was excellent. Really appreciate it. Actually, I have a question from Peter Schmidt. He would like to say something. Go ahead, Peter. Representative Schmidt.
Okay, I'll spare you all the awful sight of me in the flesh here, but short of bribery, I've done everything to encourage my Democratic colleagues anyway to attend this Zoom this evening. And I don't know that I've had anything to do with any of them, but there are only about 4 or 5 of us on here at the moment. So I would suggest to those people who are New Hampshire residents who think that this whole concept makes some tremendous sense, that you reach out to my colleagues on the Democratic side anyway, and urge them to open their eyes to this information, because if they don't know about it, they can't be supportive of it.
Yeah, in New Hampshire, unfortunately, this, I guess in the US, this has become a partisan issue. The Democrats in the House have voted very favorably on carbon pricing. There was a resolution against carbon pricing last session, and it passed in the House, but all of the Democrats voted against it, and a few of the Republicans and the independents voted against it. So that was progress. We have more progress to make with the Republicans. So if you have Republican representatives that represent your town, please talk to them too. Tell them climate is a concern, and tell them about carbon cash back. Thank you so much, Peter. That's related also to a question from Cynthia Walter, who asked about what kinds of disinformation from the fossil fuel industry should we be ready to counter. We know the fossil fuel industry has become masters at disinformation, and we see that in New Hampshire. Overwhelming public support for a lot of clean energy bills, a study on the impacts of a federal carbon fee and dividend on New Hampshire and how we can prepare. These get turned around through disinformation, and the groups are called conservative thought think tanks, but they're 80% conservative and they're 20% fossil fuel industry Trojan horse attack on New Hampshire. And it's that 20% that is fooling a lot of our representatives into voting against our best interests. And we just need to be louder to members of both parties, but especially to the Republicans. They have our best interests at heart, but they're being confused by misinformation. So I have a couple slides. Are we all set, Peter?
Yeah, thank you, John. Can I just add one thing I would say is that this is an equal opportunity. There's a misinformation on both sides, I'd say politically. And I think you and Representative Schmidt were right. And, the default is contract your representatives on the state level and nationally as often about this, and tell your friends and neighbors and folks who are run businesses, other import to do likewise. Because there's skepticism about market, on the extreme left, there's also skepticism about, well, markets got us into this. And my experience of doing many of these presentations is that depending on the crowd, I can tell where the political leanings are because of where we're talking about. We're not going to, if you're not a fan of market capitalism and you want to rework the system and use climate change as an opportunity to do so, we don't have the time for that. Plus, markets can be incredibly efficient, and this checks a lot of boxes for both parties. Helping poor, stabilizing the climate, but also, not growing the size of government, using markets to our advantage, and also giving a broad advantage for incentives to get us off of our carbon addiction.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so I've got a couple slides, a fun video, and then some actions for us to take. Whoop. Sorry, I forgot to share sound. Okay, here we go. Okay, so there was just a question about our is the economics of carbon pricing and carbon fee and dividend being taught in schools. It certainly is. This is a solution that came from economists. Nordhaus got a Nobel Prize for his work, decades of work on carbon pricing. And the idea came from George Shultz and James Baker, economists that worked in conservative president administrations. Our own current US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, says we cannot solve the climate crisis without effective carbon pricing. She must have run her policy preferences through En-ROADS, because that's what you learn through a basic economic analysis of this problem. The IPCC says explicit carbon prices remain a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies, and they're talking about 2 degrees or the 1.5 degree target. And in their most recent 6th assessment, they stated carbon pricing is most effective if revenues are returned to taxpayers corresponding to widely accepted notions of fairness. Okay, so we've got economists behind the idea. Now let's spend 2 minutes seeing what chickens think about carbon pricing.
This is Sally. She's like most chickens her age. She'll grow up in a place like this. And that means Sally's hiding something. A carbon footprint. Sally's farm uses electricity from a coal-fired power plant. Her farmer drives a diesel pickup, and her feed comes from a factory that consumes its own electricity and fuel. Now, meet Colin. Colin was raised on a solar-powered farm, eating locally sourced feed. Today, raising Colin is more expensive than raising Sally, because carbon-free energy is currently more expensive than fossil fuels. But someday soon, Sally's carbon footprint could tip the scales. Why? If we want to keep a livable climate, we have to put way less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. You've got 2 basic options. You could make a law that limits how much fossil fuels a person or company can burn, and penalize them if they break the law. Sort of like a speeding ticket. Laws like that aren't always popular though. That's where the second option comes in. Putting a price on carbon emissions. Right now you can put as much carbon dioxide into the air as you like, without paying a dime. But what if people had to pay? Almost 20 countries around the world have adopted a carbon tax. Here's how it works. Companies pay a tax when they buy fossil fuels like coal or natural gas. The price is based on how much carbon is in the fuel. And then they try to pass those costs on to customers. That means with a carbon tax, the cost of raising Sally goes up. And ultimately, when it's time for Sally to go to the great chicken afterlife, it should be easier for consumers to pick Colin for dinner.
Okay, so and that's why coal-powered chicken nuggets become more expensive than green chicken nuggets. And the carbon price reflects, is a price signal that is reflected throughout the whole economy, and it gets everybody, all the market actors in the economy, doing their part to reduce pollution because it costs money to reduce it. So you saw this, a similar picture to this before from the World Bank report, The State and Trends of Carbon Pricing. The video is 7 years old, and it said 20 countries are pricing carbon. Now 70 countries and regions are pricing carbon. So there's big progress, but as Peter mentioned, not everybody has a sufficiently high carbon price to drive emissions down at the pace required. We talked about the carbon fee and dividend policy before, but the elevator pitch is simply we charge a fee on fossil fuels for the carbon in their fuels based on the CO2 equivalent emissions that are released when they're burned. So we charge coal, oil, and natural gas producers and importers a steadily rising carbon fee. The money is collected in a carbon trust by the IRS and rebated monthly back to all households on an equal per capita basis. All the money collected minus administration costs is rebated back to families each month. And this more than covers the cost for nearly all low and middle income households. And then we apply border carbon adjustments as necessary in trade with countries that don't match our carbon price. And this makes our businesses more competitive because the US has a cleaner economy than developing countries. And it also strongly encourages every other country to match our carbon price. We saw, Peter also showed a graph from the household impact study. This is another view of it. The bottom 20% of households by consumption, 99% of them either come out ahead financially or break even. And in New Hampshire, it's so close to 100% that the graph for New Hampshire says 100% of our low-income households break even or come out ahead, as well as most middle income and half of the high-income families. You'll often hear, but what about China? Well, from the World Bank report, we know China does have a carbon price. It's just not very high. It's about $9 per ton of CO2 emitted right now in their industrial sector. But China in 2015 came out with a goal, made in China 2025, and they listed 10 areas in which they wanted to focus and become a leader in the global economy. And it included electric cars and clean energy generation. So China is a big producer, but per capita only half as much CO2 emissions compared to the United States. But they have 4 times as many people, so they do produce twice as much CO2 as the US does now. The border carbon adjustment mechanism is how we can get climate policy pushed around the world. And as Peter mentioned, the EU voted last week to implement their carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM. They're going to start taxing a carbon tax on imports on paper in October and for real starting in 2026. Canada, which has a price of about $50 per ton of CO2 US with their carbon cashback program, has been talking about a CBAM for years. And what economists say is likely is once a big economy like the EU imposes a CBAM, smaller economies can join in. They're calling it a carbon club. So because by 2030, Canada's price will be $135 per ton. Most likely, Canada and the EU will have a carbon import tax-free trade zone, but just charge importers into that carbon club their CBAM. The UK and Japan are also considering CBAMs because they price carbon also. And this is, just for trade reasons, the US should start a carbon price and have an associated CBAM to make US businesses more competitive in our own marketplace and help motivate the rest of the world to match our carbon price. If the EU, Canada, UK, Japan, and US price carbon, that's more than half of the global economy. It would be pretty easy to make sure the rest of the world follows in suit with an adequate carbon price. So how can we help? Okay, Susan, if you have something you can paste into chat, I will talk through it here. We're going to paste 8 ideas for how you can take action. One of them you can do right now. This one is easy. Talk with your friends and family about the climate problem, but especially climate solutions, and hopefully especially carbon cashback. The other solutions are easier. Carrots are easier to get past. Planting trees are, who's going to disagree with that? And once people understand that they'll probably come out ahead with carbon cashback, that becomes an easy thing to talk about too. And we need more people talking about it. You can write an LTE or op-ed or call a radio station or a TV station. If you hear something that doesn't sound right, like they're saying we can wait, or there's some greenwashing going on, call and complain. And vote, of course. But talk with candidates before you do. I have a lot of fun on election day going down the row of candidates that are standing there with signs, and I ask them what their position on climate is. And if more of us do that, more candidates will care about climate. And then they'll also listen to us more carefully when we talk to them once they're elected. And you can testify at State House hearings in person or online. There's a link on how to monitor the state bills that are going on each week through the New Hampshire Network website, and tips on how to submit your testimony online. Contact your town leaders, state representatives, and Congress. As Representative Schmidt said, talk to them. Just give them a call and ask them to take a look at this because you're interested in it. And then, of course, join a group, for example, Citizens Climate Lobby. So, Susan, have you pasted that
Yes.
into chat? Great, thank you. So
Yes.
whoever wants to, well, everybody, please copy and paste that. I will send those in an email to the whole group when we've got the recording loaded online. Also, but tonight, take an action. Click on that, send an email to Congress link, put in your contact information so the tool can identify your members of Congress. And you don't even have to change the message. It provides one for you, but you can add your own take on it. Maybe a sentence or two about why climate is so important for you to act on. But the important thing is that we do act now. Marshall Saunders is the founder of Citizens Climate Lobby about 15 years ago, retired real estate developer, wanted to do something about climate in a bipartisan way and a really big way. And that is lobbying Congress for a really beneficial, equitable, but especially powerful climate solution, and that's carbon fee and dividend. So I used to think that the important people were taking care of the important problems, but I don't think that anymore. Preserving a livable world is up to us little people. What we do and do not do really matters. So that's all we have for our En-ROADS workshop, but don't go anywhere. Susan Richmond has some important information about what is coming up in the New Hampshire Network, exciting activities for the next couple of weeks. And I'd really like to thank everybody for spending the time tonight and learning more about what we need to do in this world to preserve a livable world. Thank you.
So Peter and John, thank you. That was beyond words wonderful. John, can you put up that final PowerPoint that has our dates and addresses? So this event was engineered through New Hampshire Network in partnership with CCL. And if you get our New Hampshire Network emails, you'll find out when John is having more regular climate meetings where you can continue to learn about CCL and take actions with New Hampshire Network. The network is just that, a place where people can send us information about environment, energy, and climate, and we turn around and send it to everyone who is part of our email group. Upcoming events, May 8th, about food for thought, how we can build a climate resilient food system in New Hampshire. It's featuring the New Hampshire Food Alliance. We'll hear from Representative Karen Ebel, who's on the Waste Management Committee, I think it is, and Colleen Stewart of UNH Sustainability Institute. And then June 5, Clearing Up the Fog, Misconceptions Around Offshore Wind in New Hampshire. For example, whales are not being killed because of construction of offshore wind. So there's, we've talked about what are the misconceptions around carbon pricing, and there are plenty of them also surfacing with offshore wind. So June 5 is a chance to learn about that. And then we have regular meetings. There's a plastics working group. And I saw Cynthia had a good question about how plastics affect carbon and vice versa. So maybe that'll be a discussion. Their meeting will be this coming Sunday at 6 p.m. John has a climate working group meeting May 3rd, and then legislation tentatively is planned for May 9th. So we hope that you'll join us again, and feel free, if you've got good ideas, come to our meetings and start some programs of your own. That's www.writeitallout, climate.org. Thanks so much for being on tonight. And thank you again, John and Peter, for brilliant.
Thank you for having us. Good night, everybody.
Yes, thanks so much for your time and your help.